if someone out there has an ambitious career path, they're seeking a C-suite role, they're seeking a senior executive role of any kind, all those things have to come together to create a career path that results in the outcome. And in order to get to that, if you stay at one company, it's very possible, but your opportunities are limited, right? Because people either need to leave or they need to move out to other roles for whatever reason. And sometimes that's not readily available. And the higher you go, the less those opportunities come open.
Welcome to the CEO Sessions, hosted by Ben Fanning. And here's Ben.
I've got a fun episode in store for you today with my good friend, Brian Simons, who actually I worked for years ago, and he is founder and CEO at Janus Logistics Technologies now, which was actually born from a real-world need to enhance service part logistics. Janus is a venture-backed technology and logistics company that is radically transforming the warehousing, forward stocking, forecasting and planning, and distribution delivery for service supply chains globally. His company provides solutions for global clients spanning a range of markets, including high-tech, chemicals and hazardous goods, aerospace, and industrial goods. Previously, Brian served as COO and Executive Vice President at CIOX Health and had senior-level positions at Universal Health Systems, NCR, Honeywell, and United Technologies. Brian has an MBA and Bachelors degree from Arizona State with a PhD, that's right, a PhD from the University of Lancaster. He also serves as an adjunct professor at the University of Minnesota, and I really like the class he teaches here. His upper division management course brings together key elements from practical experience from being on the job, theoretical study in the classroom, all come together to broaden students' understandings of management as a profession. What you're going to discover in this fun episode today, what happened when Brian surprised me with a trip to the U.S. Open Final. I'll think you'll like that story. How playing sports, and for Brian, it was quarterback in high school and in college, prepared him for the C-suite. What you need to do to persuade your organization to support your graduate education. And Brian dives into that. Both the advantages and disadvantages of pursuing a PhD on your path to the C-suite. This is a really niche area. If you're in the C-suite or on that path and you're considering higher level education for yourself, he makes some great points. And we go over what questions you should ask when considering pursuing either the MBA or the PhD. Brian's got both of these and gone down both these paths and has some nice insight. Then what to consider when you're thinking about leaving corporate life to start your own company. And then the mystical skill of pitching your ideas to the C-suite, how to help your employees who seem burned out. And then we wrap up with Brian's difficult story of the very first employee he had to fire. It actually happened to be his friend. You're going to get a lot out of today's episode. Enjoy. Hey, Brian, thanks for being here. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ben. Delighted to be here. I appreciate the invite.
Yeah, so let's get this thing started off right. For our listeners, I actually used to work for this guy, and I'm still, like, despite my best efforts, he was still able to go to the top, even though I probably thwarted him with my poor performance at times. But Brian, thanks for being on here. So let's start out by talking a little tennis. Brian took me, when I was on his team, he took me and another guy to the U.S. Open Final. And Brian, you want to set the stage of that? It was Djokovic Nadal, right?
Yeah, I want to say it was 2009, 2010. It was the first time that Federer had fell out of the top two, and Djokovic and Nadal were 1 and 2 in the final at the U.S. Open. And I remember we had some meetings that week, so we showed up early to go on the Sunday.
Yeah,
when it rained.
Yeah.
And we ended up coming back on Monday night in Manhattan traffic to watch the match. And I thought it was a great experience. I've gone to see many championship level sporting events, from baseball to football to soccer. And that was one of my favorite memories to see those guys in their up and coming prime and share that with good people like yourself. So that was a great experience for me.
Yeah, I mean, talking about knowing how to delight your employees, it pretty much blew me away. And here was a little side story. I had been the previous night to the Alabama Penn State football game in Tuscaloosa. Drove to spent the night in Atlanta. Got on the flight the next day because I was so excited. I got in there, and on my flight, I was actually sitting next to Chris Fowler from ESPN, who was going to call that tournament after he had done the football game in Tuscaloosa the night before.
Well, I'm sure it was a bigger delight for you to talk to him about the football game, knowing that you're
we beat Penn State that day. Yeah.
That's the only thing I will ever hold against you in perpetuity, Ben, is being a huge Tide fan the way you are.
Oh, I can't help myself. I cannot help myself. So that is actually a good segue. So one of the interesting things, many interesting things about you, but one of the things that really sort of sticks out in my mind is the fact that you played quarterback in high school and college. One of the, all positions are important in football, but I mean, nothing happens without the quarterback, obviously. How did this unique experience help you in your career, Brian?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of connection between sport and professional success. Actually, there's some data out there around Fortune 500 CEOs and how many of them participated in sports at the collegiate level. And it's a big number. I can't remember. It might be 80 or 90% of them did something related to sports in college. And I think there's a lot that comes out of that as an experience for young people. When I think about it, and I think people get fascinated by popular sports and popular positions. But when you think about what it takes to participate, first of all, and second of all, to be successful, there's a lot of things that translate well into business. When you look at participating on a team where the team goals and objectives should be more important than your individual goals and objectives, there's a lifestyle that comes with that that's really valuable in a business setting. When you're operating within a team or a company and you understand how your efforts lead to broader victories as opposed to your egocentric success. And I think that's really important. Also, there's an element of risk in there. Every time you perform in athletics, you're risking failure and embarrassment and all sorts of interesting things that cause you to inspect your motivations and your confidence and most importantly, your preparation. And I think that's really important. And also adversity. There's always adversity, no matter who you are or what you're doing. And what sport taught me a lot was through adversity comes learning and growth. And I think that that's really important in business because you're not going to, as a former boss of mine told me, you're never going to bowl a perfect game every day. And so you need to deal with the element of failure and the things that come with failure and how you define success. But I tell you, Ben, I think the most important thing that came out of that for me is around coaching and self-awareness. Because when you go through a sporting experience, you're getting constant feedback, whether it's the response of the spectators, it's the scoreboard, it's a coach in a film session or whatever. And oftentimes that feedback can be brutal, sometimes really brutal. And, the ability to consume feedback, to consume the fact that you're not perfect, to create self-awareness, which I think is one of the most important aspects of professional behavior, I think was probably the most important thing that I got out of it, along with some great experiences and friends and things like that. But that's how I translated those things in my life. And I think there's a lot of opportunities there. I think things like Title IX and other elements that give more equal opportunity in sports are really important because it gives a broader group of people just to experience those things. They don't need to be playing for Alabama for a BCS championship to get the benefits that I've described here. They can go through these experiences at any school, in any sport, and if they're paying attention through those experiences, they can leave with a tremendous amount of value.
Fantastic. No, fantastic points here, Brian. So that time as a quarterback, even before that, did you see yourself? Obviously, you were leading on the field, but did you see yourself rising to the C-suite early on when you were growing up in that little town in Arizona?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think that I was focused on the C-suite specifically as a young person. In fact, when I was early in my teen years, my focus and goal was actually to go to the Air Force Academy and become a fighter pilot. Now, with that said, I had a tremendous amount of ambition. That's always been there in my mind. Because I wanted to go do that. I wanted to fly F-15s back then, give you an idea of how old I am. And ultimately, after
Top
doing
gun,
that,
baby.
maybe become an astronaut. Yeah, that's right. And then, maybe become an astronaut or something, when I was done with those experiences and achieve great things on a big stage, But as I grew up, I had some physical challenges with eyesight and things like that sort of precluded me from pursuing those things. And each thing that I focused on subsequent to that, I think always came with the notion that I was going to try to reach the top, be the best, have great achievement in my life. And then as I got into my undergraduate studies and started focusing on a business degree, I think that's where I started honing in on really achieving something great in the business world. And then shortly after college, I took my first job in a warehouse. That was my first supply chain job, fell in love with it. And that's when I really focused on COO jobs. I just thought that was an outcome for me. I thought that supply chain and logistics was the quickest avenue to get to the COO type of role. And that's kind of how I arrived at it. So I think the ambition was consistent throughout my youth. The focus on the C-suite within a business role, I think, came later, in my early 20s type of a thing.
So building on that, you may be the only supply chain expert, leader, company owner that I know that has a doctorate. So you went all the way with your education. Is that, I don't want to guide your response, but is that sort of in line with, hey, my ambition, I want to be the best, be extremely, just excel, or where did that come from? And how has that played out for you since you achieved that?
So, my educational story has been an interesting one, and it certainly hasn't been linear. I would declare that up front. When I was a younger person, I would argue in my undergraduate studies, I was an average student at best, had a lot of fun, had a lot of other activities going on. And, I was pretty much an average student at best. And what I found as I went through my life is that there are certain behaviors associated with knowledge and growth that I didn't have as a younger person. And it sort of fed my performance in my undergraduate studies. When I graduated, I became the first person in my family with a degree. So I'm one of these people. And I knew that if I wanted to get into the C-suite, it would help my chances if I went and got a graduate degree. So in my late 20s, I went back and did my MBA with a focus on supply chain and operations. And during that time, I really found a passion for knowledge and more specifically in reading. And this was a real pivot point in my life, actually. So as I finished out my MBA, I wanted to continue that activity. And I really found that I had a bit of an insatiable desire for growth and knowledge. And now that I had found that, I had started talking to some of my professors around pursuing a doctorate. And I decided to take a year off after the master's. And a year later, I had begun a doctorate program. And what was interesting was how far the distance was between the academic life and the business life. So, what I found in that
you invested a lot of time in that, as I recall. It's one thing to get your master's, right? But when you do a doctorate, that's at a whole nother level of academic commitment, right?
Yeah, this is a 5 to 6 year commitment. It was actually sponsored by Honeywell, my employer at the time. And there was a project associated with it that was connected to my job responsibilities at Honeywell. And so, yeah, this was a well-aligned type of thing. And it also aligned with, what I had thought many times about doing in retirement. I thought, I want to get into the C-suite and achieve great things. And then I would like to retire at a reasonable age and go teach young people, And so for me, this is a great roadmap, as I map out the rest of my life. And so that was really attractive to me back then as those choices were being made. What I thought was incredibly interesting about going through that experience, though, is that, your business life is focused on certain elements of how you do your own research, how you make arguments and use persuasion, and how you communicate, because in business, there's a premium on brevity, there's a premium on data and metrics, and there's a premium on persuasion. And that is a 180 from what I found in a doctoral program, which is focused on academic writing, which is very long and dry and sometimes very boring. The intent of the writing is really around defending the points that you're making from current research and potential future research. So it's less about persuasion and more about building on points of research and logic and data and empirical data. And so, it's really two separate lives, and what came out of that was a really interesting supply chain risk and design tool for Honeywell. And for me, it was a great experience to really learn new ways to research problems. It gave me a broader perspective on how to look at data in situations so that I can see it from other people's perspectives and consider other arguments that might be legitimate. And it gave me a real view into, the difficulties of actually growing knowledge and influencing people without using highly persuasive tactics like emotion or biased types of writing and communication. So it was a really interesting experience for me.
Say a listener's thinking, well, man, maybe I should go get my doctorate, and I'm working for this company right now, and they're thinking about your example. What's the thought process you would use to weigh, should I go and get the doctorate, or should I not go do that? I mean, what questions would you recommend that they think about when they're trying to make that decision?
I think the biggest question is really, why do you want one? Because if you view that process as being a qualification or a plaque you're going to hang on the wall, it's probably not a great avenue for you, because the doctoral process is something that it's just that, it's a process. And the process itself is focused on creating academics. And so if your goals are not aligned with that, if you don't draw your energy from these things, it's really not a great avenue for you. Secondly, in business, they tend to be full-time programs. Some programs in Europe prepare people for consulting or government work. But, if you don't have an interest in teaching at some point, it's not a useful program. Now, there are some doctorates out there. If you're just looking for a qualification, you can go do it. But if you're just thinking this will enhance my business career, I've actually found, and some people who know me who are listening to this are probably surprised to hear this, actually, because I don't bring it up terribly often, because it either turns people off because they think I'm an academic.
They don't call you Dr. Simons, right? You don't have that on your business card that you're Dr. Simons. Right?
Yeah, you won't find anything anywhere. Sometimes I'll refer to a school program or I did a doctoral program, but it's almost a detriment in the business setting. So if you don't have a goal, in terms of teaching or becoming, a member of academia or something like that, it's not a terribly great avenue, because there's other things that you can do to feed your intellectual curiosity. That will cost less, that will take less time, and will be more applicable to an ambitious business career.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, let me move on to one of the other questions, Brian. So if you look at your career path, you have worked for several different organizations, and whereas some C-suite leaders, they just stay with one company or maybe two companies, And it seems like looking at your path, you've moved up most companies, whenever you've made that change. And I was curious, what have the pros and cons to that type of career path been for you?
Yeah, it's a classic question, and it comes down to risk, it comes down to loyalty, and it comes down to, frankly, opportunity and a bit of luck. Because if someone out there has an ambitious career path, they're seeking a C-suite role, they're seeking a senior executive role of any kind, all those things have to come together to create a career path that results in the outcome. And in order to get to that, if you stay at one company, it's very possible, but your opportunities are limited, right? Because people either need to leave or they need to move out to other roles for whatever reason. And sometimes that's not readily available. And the higher you go, the less those opportunities come open. And so that's one element of this. The second thing I would tell people is really around compensation, because as you move up within a company, your compensation is often limited based on HR policies or general practices, where the increases in compensation you can get by leaving a company are often substantially bigger than you can by even taking a promotion within the same firm. And then, the risk element is there because every time you leave a company, you're taking a risk. It's the devil you know versus the devil you don't know. And when you go into a new company, and I've seen this a couple of times in my career, the circumstances can be really, really difficult. The culture or the circumstances and what you expected. I had a couple of assignments where, my boss actually left shortly after I showed up, which created a tremendous amount of uncertainty. And, things like that have to be weighed based on what the person is willing to deal with in terms of risk, what they're trying to achieve, and the opportunities that they think are in front of them. So I think either one is feasible. I chose multiple companies. I spent the first roughly 20 years of my career at 3 companies because I did 2 stints at Honeywell. And basically, the moves that I made all had a purpose on the roadmap of my career outcome that I had intended. And usually when I coach people who ask me, questions like these, the first thing I tell them is that a career path is never linear. So you should never assume that it's just going to be from A to B to C. And secondly, you have to weigh your options based on what you think is going to come available. So each career choice I made had to do with, where I was trying to go, skills I was trying to build, opportunities that were in front of me. And I think it's worked out well for me. If those things are happening for you at the same company, then great. And that's what you want to do, then stick with it. So I think either one's okay as long as you're aligned with what you're trying to accomplish and what's being presented to you.
And you eventually started your own company after all these years working for fairly large organizations. What would you recommend when someone's trying to weigh that of starting their own company versus staying on more the traditional corporate route?
Yeah, boy, it's different. And I don't think I recognized it fully until I had, both feet in it and was really fighting the good fight, So when I think about big company roles and lifestyle, I think about bureaucracy. I think about more security. I think about politics. I think about those things. Those are kind of the underlying themes of that lifestyle. If you're working at I would call it mid to large size company. And those things are all manageable, but they can be frustrating. And the upside is limited, right? Because the things that you do there, your upside is limited to whatever your compensation plan, defines, and whatever the organization is willing to support in terms of your career growth and your own growth, your personal growth. And so, there's ups and downs to every situation. And I think big companies, they tend to fit into what I just described. When you think about the entrepreneurial lifestyle, it's basically the opposite of all that. I think politics are greatly reduced. Agility is way, way up because there's very little bureaucracy. But at the same time, the risk is insanely higher. And so, if you're a person that prefers to live your life with a steady paycheck and incremental improvements to your wealth and security, and you don't mind that it's the share price going up based on the contributions you're making and things like that, the big company is probably a good lifestyle for you. If you can stomach the risk, if you're well funded, if you have some concepts that really mean something in the marketplace, the entrepreneurial side may be appealing, to that kind of a person. So for me, my personal decision was one that I had a concept that I believed was valuable to the marketplace. For probably 10 or 12 years prior to launching my business, I was stifled from implementing these things in the big company format. I had spent 20 years of my career in what I view to be training and achievement in the big company format, and also building credibility in a network that could become valuable in an entrepreneurial venture. And it was just a great time for me to go and launch my own business to try and achieve some great things away from the big company format that I believed I could do in a smaller company, which means that all the risk was on me, and all the upside then subsequently from here on out is also on me. And so that was my mindset as I went and did it. And I've not regretted it. I've lost sleep over it. And, I'm in a position now where it's exciting for me. I draw a lot of energy from it, and I'm excited about my future. So for me, that means that I probably made the right decision.
Yeah, what a great breakdown for the listeners who are considering that, because I know a lot of people have that reel playing in their mind of maybe I should go try that idea. And I liked a lot of what you said there, especially around, hey, I had tried to implement these ideas in the bigger company format and it just wasn't really resonating. So you pursued it outside. So, there are a lot of directions we could go, right? But I don't want to get too far away from the point where you were able to go get your doctorate. And one of the questions that comes up is when an employee has a big idea, what's your advice on how they should communicate it to the C-suite? So I could take that two different directions. One is you were able to work with your organization, right, on your idea to go pursue your doctorate, and they were able to support that. And knowing you and all the ideas you have, and eventually you launching your own business, you've had experiences pitching your ideas inside organizations, pitching your ideas to organizations, and by the way, having employees, right, and pitch their ideas to you. So I'm really curious, when an employee has a big idea, what's your advice on how they should communicate it to the C-suite?
Yeah, this is a really key skill in my mind, because the translation that occurs in the C-suite is sometimes mystical to the broader, population of team members within a company. Because when you think about what's happening at senior levels, there's a pressure from, I'd call it above, which includes owners or shareholders. It might include the board of directors. It might include, other stakeholders like consultants or whatever. And those conversations tend to be highly quantifiable. What those stakeholders are usually interested in have to do with numbers, have to do with the value of the company, and then always in one way or another come back to this concept of growth. And so if you sit in those meetings, these are the themes. There's always different topics and projects and, plans and things like that. But these are the general themes that tend to happen in those meetings. And with that said, senior executives then have to translate that, because when they message and they look at a business, there's tons of operational elements that come into that. And that translation is really what's on the mind of a lot of, especially operations folks that are at senior levels within companies. And so when team members come with ideas, they're usually good ideas. But the concept that I usually tell people is between two different elements of a concept being pitched. One that's interesting and one that's valuable. And the difference between those two concepts, to me, is almost everything, because I think some team members can frustrate themselves by bringing forward a really good idea, and it's really interesting, but it's not aligned to some concept that creates value for the business, and that might be secondhand, thirdhand value. That's okay. But if you're unable to message that, it's really tough, I believe, to get the real attention of people in the C-suite to hear about your concept or your project, unless you can translate that into some level of value rather than it's just an interesting idea. And so my advice to people usually is around defining the outcomes. So, if you want a new computer system or you want to go implement, a new design on something, these are all interesting concepts. But if you can clearly define what the outcome is, this is going to drive another $1 million in revenue, or this is going to specifically reduce the turnover of our employees. And we know that turnover costs X, and that means that this will translate into, X times whatever in terms of benefit to the company. Or service is always a great one too. This is our on-time delivery or our service level attainment or whatever the business might measure. This is a concept that affects this part of the business, and then this is the outcome in terms of service. And those kinds of things are the ones that generally get the attention of senior executives. So, my advice, I'll just bring it back again because I think it's really important. Just make sure whether your idea is interesting or it's valuable, and then clearly, use data, your experience, and clearly message the connection between the value and what you're proposing. And generally speaking, you'll get good attention from senior execs this way.
And I have seen you in action on that, so I can vouch for that.
Well, you and I did some of that together, and in fact, I'll share something about you, Ben. Ben actually came to me, you came to me with your crazy idea around culture, and this was crazy when we first sat and talked about it around burnout, around coaching people. And you had this passion around this side of your potential career path that really had very little to do with what you did for a living at the time,
Yeah. Yep.
And yet we sponsored that, and you sold me on it.
Totally.
And I thought it was a great idea because you had great concepts around how you could fulfill your job requirements and still have a broader influence over our local team, around the broader corporate teams. You did some coaching with other team members. You were actually helping me do my job as a leader. And that's what I mean, So as I was considering that, I thought, and this is a great example. Here's a guy who wants to make a pivot in his career, and yet he sold me on this in terms of value, in terms of what it means to me, and that's really why we sponsored that. It was a really interesting engagement with you on that, and I'm really proud of it. By the way, when I read your book, I thought this is one of the great outcomes of those decisions, and I was really, really proud of how that came out.
Well, thank you for saying that. And clearly your openness as a leader opened that path for me to start going down and to contribute. And thank you for that. Thanks for mentioning that, Brian. Speaking of that, and talking about burnout, if you had someone who reported to you that was obviously burned out and you thought they might quit, how would you approach them? Or how have you approached them in the past?
Yeah, this is not uncommon, so the concept of burnout is something that is out there. And I think the pressure on businesses, not just today, but in recent years and even decades, the pressure just continues to increase. Productivity needs to continue going up. Competition continues, to increase. And what that means is there will always be additional pressure on the people doing the work. And, with all that said, leaders have to be equipped to deal with this. And they also have to realize that they can't win every battle because usually when I talk to people, not just about business, but about just the human experience, the first thing that I go after, and this is sort of how I frame this issue if I'm ever looking at it, is that there has to be some alignment between who that person is, where they draw their energy from, what they enjoy doing, and what they actually do for a living. And I've found just in life in general, where people, if there's misalignment between who they are and what they want to be, it leads to very self-destructive outcomes. It's a very interesting dynamic. So if you hate numbers and you're in a finance job, that's very destructive. If you hate talking to people and you're in a sales job, again, very destructive. And so the first thing that I do when I look at that is I try to evaluate the distance between those two things. Here's someone who I perceive to have an issue with burnout. Here's what they're doing for a living. Here's their performance. Here's their engagement with the team. And I try to establish what's that gap between who they are and what they're doing to see if it's a job problem, it's a person problem, or something else. The second thing I'll do is I'll very sensitively, with empathy and good communication, approach the person, because I think the first action in any situation like this is to broach the topic openly and candidly, but without doing it in a threatening way, and without doing it in a way that causes the person to increase their anxiety. Hey, let's talk about what's happening. You just look really stressed out. I'm concerned about you. And I just want to see how things are going and what I can do to potentially support you, And if you frame things in this way to get information from them about what the real core issues are, I think a leader can either choose to address those things or choose to make other changes. The other element is sometimes it's not going to work. As I mentioned, you're not going to win every battle. And sometimes the right answer is to make a change. Either that person makes a change or you as a leader make a change. It could be a change in their job scope. It could be a change where they need a different job, or it could be a change where they're leaving the business. And again, that can be made on either side of the conversation. And so I think if you're open to that, so that you're not thinking, I need to save this person, or, I need to do something that's unnatural to make this thing work, I think that helps put some boundaries around trying to define a solution. And then from there, I think if you achieve alignment, you make sure they're in the right place with the right job scope. The last step is just to make sure that they are empowered to be successful, which again is another classic leadership tactic.
Yeah, so really basing it on an individual level. And I really like the way you're saying you're kind of diving into the individual, understanding, their strengths and what they enjoy doing versus the value their job's creating for the company, and trying to find a creative solution. Now, if say, in the past, without naming names, what's a colorful moment where, I'm just curious, and you don't have to answer this if it's not the right question, but what's a time, without naming names, where someone quit or was fired in a very colorful sort of way that you recollect? Anything come to mind?
This is this activity, by the way, where you are in a situation where you have to terminate an employee. This is something you should never enjoy. You should never love doing it. You should also never shy away from it. This is one of those tough things that you have to do as a leader from time to time. And if you do them right, it should be a situation that's respectful on all sides. It's a decision that shouldn't be a terribly huge surprise to any party involved. And it should end up as a positive event for everyone, even as negative as it might be in the moment. Because if you're making these decisions on the right basis, someone's going to be upset or they're going to be hurt, but a year or two later, they might be in a much better situation themselves personally. And then you as a business are also in a better situation. That really should be the outcome of each event like this. So with that said, I would actually argue that my first event in my career is probably the most colorful. And I would argue that it's because I wasn't as skilled at dealing with the choice and the engagement and communication as I became later in my career. And so it turned out to be a fairly bad experience, And the person that was affected was actually a friend of mine. That was my first mistake.
Ouch.
Secondly, the person was surprised by the decision, which was it was a layoff decision. It wasn't a performance decision. And then third, I just handled the conversation very poorly. So the response, in the room at the time was, "That's all you have to say to me." And it went downhill from there. So very, very bad situation. And I would argue that it was bad because of how I handled it. And it was also bad as to how I arrived at that choice. And again, I think everything worked out in the end, but that was a really bad situation caused by the things I've described.
Yeah, I think the first one, probably for most people, is never pretty. And then you add friendship and whatnot. No, I can imagine. Well, Brian, if you have time, I've got a couple more questions here.
Sure. Yeah, let's go for it.
One of the things is, when's a time that you had an unexpected twist or failure in your career, and how did it lead to growth or success down the road? I've always had the perspective on you where you spend a lot of time in self-reflection, like thinking back to how things went and growing from there. But did you have an example that you could share with us?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot, and I'd go back to my comments earlier around, the sports connection, in that failure, how you view failure is really specialized to how much success you're going to achieve in your career. I would say it in that way. So, that word failure is really funny, because if you really think about, how do you define failure? Is it, did I miss a number? Did I not get a job? Or did I make a mistake? Or whatever. This word failure is a really interesting one. And I appreciate your kind words. I do think I spend a ton of time around self-reflection and self-awareness, which I think is one key attribute of a good leader. And so, I have many of these experiences where I would argue that I had a failure. The one I bring up here, given the context of our conversation, was actually a Honeywell conversation where actually it was when you and I were working together. So this is a long time ago. It's probably 10 years ago.
Hopefully not a failure that I caused.
Yes, no. That might be on the list, but not this particular example. But there was a job that came open at Honeywell, and it was sort of on my roadmap. This was a job that I had spent 7 or 8 years preparing for. It was almost tailor-made for me, and I didn't get it. I didn't get it. So what happened was twofold. I think that I had a couple of issues around the velocity with which I was coming up through the organization. I was a younger guy. And I was competing with more experienced professionals, and that created a problem for me. And then secondly there were some org changes that had occurred, and the person that ended up getting the job was someone that the organization wanted to retain, who needed a job and sufficiently fit the requirements, And so when I reflect on it in the moment, I was really upset because I thought that would have been a great step for me. It would have allowed me to stay at Honeywell. And what I ended up doing was using that experience to discover things that I continued to work on, to address my background, my skill set, my resume. And actually that experience was the beginning of my exit from Honeywell. Because again, looking at the landscape, there weren't a whole lot of other opportunities at that time that were interesting. One came up from outside the business, and I ended up accepting it because it was a very similar job to the one I was passed over for. And, it ended up being a great decision for me. But that failure was one of the first times in my career where I had really gone after a job. This wasn't just, sort of pedestrian pursuit. This was something I really, really wanted, and I didn't get it. And so that was, for me at the moment, a shock. And then it became an opportunity for me to become a better candidate for those types of roles, in the next 6 to 12 months after that.
Is there a specific process or routine that you found for reflection that's been helpful, or anything come to mind there?
This is a great topic, Ben, because I had heard a couple of times early in my career that the two things that are key for a leader, and I agree with this. One is self-awareness, and the other one is delivering results. And if you do those two things, your career is going to be on a good trajectory, whether it's at your pace or your altitude or whatever that you want. It depends on other factors. But if you can do those two things, you're going to be successful. And so I spent a lot of time on this, and sometimes it's hard, because I have a lot of, the human reactions to situations where I want to be right, where I want to be, always right, and I never want to make a mistake. And I always want to be successful and things like that. And so what I found was, I think if you can do away with the emotion of a situation, it helps people be more self-aware. If you can somehow try to define elements of circumstances rather than personalizing them, people tend to become more self-aware. But maybe most importantly is just realizing that no one is infallible, and I was fortunate through my career to have a lot of great mentors, and as I went through, growth cycles with my mentors, that's what I found, that these people openly declared what their issues were. I remember sitting with the head of operations for Honeywell Aerospace once, and this is early in my career, and I asked him, I said, listen, I really want to be in your job, so let's talk about how I get there. That was the question I had asked him. Wow. And instead of talking about business, he gave me a long lecture about the personal effects on his life, the effects on his marriage, which had just ended, the effects on his relationships with his kids, which weren't great, and things like that. And that as I was sitting there as a younger person in my 20s, I was just thinking to myself, think about the candor this person's messaging to me. Somehow he was able to step away and own the failures in his broader life that came out of his career path. And so that conversation helped me a lot in terms of work-life balance and focusing on those things as I've had my own career. But it also showed me that, it's okay. It's okay to say, hey, look, I failed at this and I'm short on that. And that's usually how I look at things, because even the greatest leaders that I've run into, all the way up to Dave Cody, by the way, who's just written an outstanding book. If you haven't read it yet, but it's really, really good. Dave in there in his book even declares, that sometimes he gets really defensive really quickly. Sometimes he can get emotional. Sometimes his patience is short, and he talks about surrounding himself with people that cover his gaps. And you can't be that kind of leader unless you can look at yourself in the mirror honestly and define what your shortcomings are. And I've got my list. Everyone has their list. And so, those are the things that I try to do. And look, I'm not perfect. Sometimes when I should be more self-aware, I get more competitive. Sometimes when I should be, one thing, I'm another. And so even at this stage in my career, I'm a work in process.
Yeah. For those listening, Brian's referring to, I believe it's Winning Now, Winning Later, right? Brian, that's Cody's book.
Yes.
Okay.
So that's the book. It just came out in the last couple of months here in the middle of 2020. And, look, Dave is a guy that I never reported to, but I was in general proximity. And he's probably one of the great CEOs, of the last 4 or 5 decades in the United States. And just I think a great guy in general, so that reads definitely one I would recommend.
Did you, first of all, are there any Dave Cody interactions that you recall? And if not, are there any other, books or mentors or authors specifically that you want to share?
Yeah, I don't have any Cody stories for this discussion.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, I've got a few we can talk about some other time, but
okay, all right.
I'll let Dave tell his own story as he's been out and just doing great things. So he's doing good stuff. But The reading thing, I think, is really important, Ben. And actually, I got a tip early in my career from a guy by the name of Dan Burnham, who spent a couple of hours with me my senior year of college. He was the vice chairman at Allied Signal at the time. And Dan ended up becoming the CEO at Raytheon before he retired. And Dan gave me tons and tons of nuggets in that discussion, which still serves some value for me today. But one of the things he told me was that, every month I should choose a book to read that has nothing to do with what I do for a living. And I thought that was puzzling in the moment. But really, Dan's point was, if you spend some time focused on topics that are not what you do 40, 50, 60 or more hours a week, you get a lot of benefit from that. Your language gets expanded. You get different perspectives on how to view situations. And what Dan really drove home was it helps you be a more strategic thinker, because now you're breaking down some boundaries of your tunnel vision around your world and your life. And you can see some other things that are out there in the world, and it helps you become a better strategic thinker. So my first tip, like Dan told me the better part of 25 years ago, is to go read a book every month that has nothing to do with what you do for a living. And then secondly, there are some great titles out there that are always going to be useful. The Larry Bossidy book on execution is always one that I recommend to people, because it sort of closes the gap between what you say and what you do. And that say-do ratio is so important. And I think Larry just cuts right to the chase, with execution. And then there's just a bunch of other stuff out there. It depends on the topics that people want to get into. As I mentioned, as I got through grad school, I became a bit of a voracious reader, and I tend to go through 3 or 4 books a month. And so I actually run out of stuff. So I tend to be looking for different titles, but I love the Yuval Harari books in terms of getting away from business and getting more into humanity and things like this. I do like to read a lot of history, just to see how things were handled, whether it be wars or politics or economics, and other things like that tend to be really appealing to me.
And what's a tool or gadget? And I'm asking this, of most of people that we interview for the show, but what's a tool or gadget that has contributed to your success that our listeners here could purchase?
Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot of technological tools and gadgets out there, and I'm going to set aside the obvious, smartphones and the wristbands for healthcare and things like this. I would actually argue the best one for me was actually a subscription to Audible, which is a audio book service. I think it's owned by Amazon now. What's not owned by Amazon, I guess, would be the follow-on question. And Audible really, for me, has been interesting because it converts a lot of time that I would have spent not being active in my mind to something that can consume materials like we were just describing, actually. So, for example, right now I'm right in the middle of listening to a book whenever I'm at the gym or in the car, or if I'm traveling. Again, I can be active, at least in my mind, which I think is really a good thing. But the book I'm right in the middle of right now is called AI Superpowers, which is on the landscape between the United States and China, developing deep learning and artificial intelligence and what it means for marketplaces out there. And that's the book of the week for me, And so, I think Audible has kind of been the best gadget for me. It's improved my listening. It's helped me to broaden the things that I can dig into in terms of books and texts. And, I would recommend it to everybody because we spend so much time that then becomes available to you to actually use the product, which I think is cool.
Fantastic. Brian, as we wrap up here, do you want to give us an update on what you're doing now? And what's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
Yeah, so right now I'm a few years into this project called Janus Logistics Technologies. It's a logistics automation business focused on using RFID technology to digitize inventory, also using some of the AI and machine learning concepts for forecasting methodologies. We built a platform around that. And we've actually gone out and signed some really interesting partnerships to then start penetrating the market on a larger scale than we've done over the last few years now. So where we're focused, is really around service businesses or businesses that have distributed inventory. We automate their inventory at various forward stocking locations globally. We give them a planning tool so they can forecast and decide what they should have and where they should have it. And then we're plugged into some really clever final mile and delivery type services that create the vertical integration of the entire supply chain. And again, this is really an answer to struggles I had, dating back 15 years that we just couldn't get solved because there wasn't a vertically integrated solution out there. And we're having great success and getting a great reception from the marketplace, including from some of the major logistics players. So that's what I'm doing now. If people want to get a hold of me, LinkedIn is always a good option, or just come out to our website, jltech.com, and there's an info email out there that you can reach out to me with as well. But yeah, we'd love to hear from people, either do some networking around leadership, or if there's some logistics topics to talk about, I love talking about that stuff as well.
Okay. Y'all make sure to put those in the show notes for Janus and also your LinkedIn profile. Well, thanks, Brian. That was a fun interview. Can't wait to see what you're going to do next, man.
Yeah, me too, Ben. I'm really excited about my future, and I'm excited about yours too. I think you've been doing some amazing stuff out there, and these podcasts are just further evidence of how you're influencing people out there and doing some good work. So on behalf of everybody, we appreciate what you're doing as well.
Ben Fanning is a #1 best-selling author, Inc. magazine columnist, and CEO of the Fanning Group, an international consultancy and corporate training company. To learn how they can help your organization, go to benfanning.com.